Hello everyone, my name is Jenna Marshall. I'm a senior researcher at the Chair of Development Policy and Postcolonial Studies. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Sara Radcliffe. She is a professor of Latin American Geography and Fellow of Christ's College at the University of Cambridge and Chair of the Management Committee at the Center of Latin American Studies. Her research interests are organized around four major areas, including intersectional dynamics of power, development and new forms of knowledge production, as well as decolonial geographies that explores the ways in which learning, writing, and doing geography can open up other ways of seeing, living in, and knowing the world. She was chair of the 2017 Royal Geographical Society with IBG conference in London under the theme Decolonizing Geographical Knowledges, and currently runs a decolonial research lab with graduates and postdoctoral fellows. Her publications explore themes including post-neoliberal development and governance, the post-colonial politics of territory and cartography, and her most recent monograph is entitled Dilemmas of Difference, Indigenous Women and the Limits of Post-Colonial Development Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Professor Sara Radcliffe.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and also to Aram and all of the organizers and facilitators of the workshop. I'm afraid that I had to skip out from an earlier session this afternoon to come and sort of do a few edits on my paper because the discussion has been so rich and so on that I wanted to engage with the presentations that I've been very lucky to be at. So, I hope to speak for about 40 minutes, but then I really want to open this out for discussion and your comments and perspectives. I want to start with just a little anecdote about work I've been doing, field work I've been doing over the last few years in three largely rural districts in the Amazon and Andes of Ecuador, looking at how Buen Vivir, living well, or Ecuador's supposedly nominally non-Western development model unfolds on the ground. In the Amazon district of what I'll call Choque, the population of 60,000 is 2/3 indigenous, 1/3 mestizos, mixed race, that is, largely European-oriented settlers from the coast, 3% people self-identified as white, and 3% Afro-descendants, and the rest comprise a number of smaller racialized groups. Could I have my water, actually, just in case? And in Choque, the administrators and politicians that we've interviewed deny there's racism. Yet racialized hierarchies and geographies are very clearly visible in the official disregard for public employment quotas, which is meant to represent indigenous people at the proportion that they are in the overall district. It is ignored, racial hierarchies is very clear in the procedures of public participation and in treating indigenous and Afro-descendants as out of place across the district. And in the urban centres, disproportionate capture of resources and infrastructure in the urban centre, whereas 4/5 of indigenous people, 1/5 of Afro-descendants, and half of other racialised groups live in rural areas. So combined with policy legal moves that dispossess indigenous communities very directly from their land, Buen Vivir in Choque, I've come to understand, represents an assault on the lives of racialized and marginalized non-white populations. They are not living well. Under Buen Vivir, race then, I would argue, is repeatedly reanimated and reconfigured as an expression of power. The broad rubric of participatory, plurinational, and equitable development exists alongside and through and perpetuates racialized dispossession and hegemonic Eurocentric common sense. Yet for many commentators, Ecuador's Buen Vivir is interpreted as decolonizing, as the country's 2008 constitution and subsequent national development plans engaged indigenous notions of sumac causai, which is seen to be translated in some interpretations into Buen Vivir, the rights of nature, or Pachamama, and the plurinational intercultural state. Now, I'm presuming that the audience here is very familiar with the Ecuadorian history of how that constitution came about, and we've had some wonderful papers describing the kind of contested spaces within and the arrival of feminist and indigenous and environmentalist ideas into those formal pieces of legislation. But the legislative context is that sufficient for identifying decolonizing? If on the ground, under these forms of legislation, what we see is that coloniality is being materialized and expressed and lived in very real ways on a daily basis. The racialization and forms of dispossession and labor insecurity and lack of voice that we see, can we really say that this is decolonizing, or should we recognize, as many commentators have, that decolonizing is in itself an incredibly complex, long drawn out, contested process in which the coloniality of, among other things, racialization, have to be continuously confronted, identified, confronted, and dismantled. So, coloniality, I'm drawing on Quijano and the Modernity Coloniality, Decoloniality School to understand how the racial hierarchies, Euro-centered capitalism, and structures of power become entangled into very many dimensions of life, including culture, labor, intersubjective relations, aspiration for the self, common sense, and knowledge production. Hence the never-ending challenge of a process of decolonizing. So although Buen Vivir was initially viewed as a beacon of hope for change, observers have since identified the factors behind the thwarting or the non-materialization of the decolonizing agendas. Some commentators focus on the hydrocarbon and mineral commodity boom of the mid-2000s to mid-2015 as the reassertion of macroeconomic capitalist interests, increasingly with the Chinese face, as the driving force in sidelining inclusive agendas. Others would emphasize the paradoxical bind between delivering popular redistribution and paying for that with hard currency earned from extractivism at the cost of indigenous territories and epistemologies. Another analytical strand focuses on how neoliberal governmentality and macroeconomic imperatives manage to insidiously rework themselves into statecraft. The pervasively Eurocentric logics and taken for granted common sense and routines of planning and bureaucracy is no doubt an additional factor, as is the colonial modern mindset and the epistemology of law itself, of rights, and of justice systems. Coloniality, in this sense, if we look across this literature, seems to be firing on all fronts and leaving little scope for decolonizing. Only recently have the pervasive effects of racialization that I started with been examined, and so I want to particularly focus on that aspect today. So in this context, what can decolonizing mean? In addressing this question, I'm intrigued by Nelson Maldonado's argument that decolonizing needs to be broader than legislative, economic, and institutional change. In his words, and I refer you to the slide, I've always found in teaching that I can never say the words on the slide as fast as you can read it, so I will leave that up for you. But to my mind, Maldonado Torres here usefully places questions of coloniality, modernity, and knowledge production and ontology, that is a sense of what exists in the world. He really brings those points together. So this afternoon, what I want to explore is what dehumanizing means and how we have to link it to processes of racialization, but also how might rehumanization take place, and how can we think about not only the ways that we are in the world, but also how we might know about the world, because I think this is also a knowledge politics. We're in a university, we're trying to understand the world better. So the issue here is about racialization. I've taken a quote from Audrey Kobayashi, a geographer, who has talked about these issues. So I wanted to just take a minute or two to explain how I see the connection between knowledge production, positionality, and racialization. These issues, I think, are very important because we have to think about perhaps how and from where and with whom we come to know about the world and how we come to know more about the world. So in the words of theorists, we want to know the geopolitical location of knowledge and also the body political location of knowledge. Gayatri Spivak has argued that we, those of us who are relatively privileged, have to engage in unlearning what we know in order to relearn in a different way, in order to disentangle ourselves from the ignorance that is sanctioned in people who are privileged. And she would suggest, as do many others, that this process of unlearning in order to start questioning our ignorance is also going to take place alongside knowledge-holding groups whose knowledges have been destroyed in the past through coloniality in a process that Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls epistemicide, and been marginalized. So that's the issue of how we can think about knowledge production and why we want to start thinking about this, and thinking about how we position ourselves and how we articulate where we are coming in that process of unlearning and in relearning. So I think this is a question of the institutional context that we're located in, some of the theoretical conceptual positions that we draw upon, but also the praxis of learning and teaching and activism. So to situate myself, I'm a critical human geographer of development of post-colonial intersectionality and of political geographies. And I'm based in a university where, of course, coloniality and modernity have been very much defined over the centuries. But perhaps more hopeful is the fact that the decolonizing of the university has been very much on the agenda over the last 3 years or so, and also where there's been a recent growth in unionism in the university. But it is a very white privileged space and context for knowledge production. And I'm speaking here both of my department of geography and of the university and of UK society. So I think I need to reflect upon what that means to be a white-positioned subject. So I'm offering here a provisional definition, which is that a white-positioned subject or knowledge is relationally positioned as more ontologically secure, that that white-positioned subjects have more security in what exists in the world and how they connect with what that world is. White-positioned subjects are often more economically privileged than racialized groups and benefit from and also express and follow white social and spatial epistemologies. Now, white positionality is, I'm trying to make it somewhat unsettling as a definition, because I think that the sort of ontological security of whiteness is one which has been based on an idea that we know exactly who a white positioned subject is, and I want to try and unsettle that. I'm taking from the ideas of intersectionality coming from black feminists and others that racial positionality is always expressed through and in connection with gender and sexuality, class, location, and education, and many other factors, migrant status, and so on. So the power of relationally positioned whiteness is a power that is expressed in terms of greater ease of access to spaces, in terms of greater ease of mobility, social mobility and spatial mobility. The power of whiteness is expressed, as I said before, in the sanctioning of ignorance of domains that fall outside that secure white position. The power of whiteness also informs presuppositions about how the world works. And if the world has been made in the vision of that white positioned subject, then of course there is that security that the world will work in that way. And the power of whiteness also is expressed in terms of it validates statements of knowledge made by white-positioned subjects. So all of these elements affect the kinds of knowledges we make and the praxis of understanding and making development. Development is a part of this racialized dynamic. So what then would it mean to decolonize development if we're looking particularly at this angle? And what I want to try and outline in the paper is a number of different points. One is that the engagement with the power of whiteness and the processes of racialization which create an anti-blackness and an anti-indigeneity within development processes. But also naming whiteness as a racial positioning and challenging the fact that whiteness has often remained unremarked and unmocked in development and in post-development, arguably, too. So, what I want to first of all do is to try and discuss the sort of relationships between racialization and life. From a black man's perspective, Frantz Fanon offered one of the most powerful accounts of colonial dehumanization by highlighting the alienation, disorientation, and feelings of rejection in a world structured around whiteness. Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, identifies what he calls a zone of non-being, by which he labels the conditions of blackness in an anti-black world. As black, indigenous, and decolonial scholars have since enumerated, modern classifications of race underpin powerful hierarchies that determine the restricted degree to which privileged subjects recognize and acknowledge subalterns' humanity. Oh, that's my outline. Here we are. So coloniality has carved up humanity into the deserving and the undeserving, the human and the subhuman, the animal and the human, in a logic driven by notions of superiority, whether that's of mind, of gender, of sexuality, and so on. The specifics and nuances of these processes differ over time and space, but have often been combined with the epistemicide of non-Western notions of social difference, humanity, and hierarchy, relationally constituted against the white position subject and his ontological security. The non-white subject is excluded and dehumanized, making her always out of place in the world. These relations are continuously grounded and expressed socially, spatially, and epistemically. Decolonial scholar Ramon Grosvogel describes the zones of non-being as not a single geography, but a positioning in global power, racial, ethnic hierarchies. Attending closely to Fanon's work, decolonial philosopher Nelson Maldonado Torres extends Fanon's analysis by discerning a broader condition, which he terms the coloniality of being. This comprises not an inevitable moment or natural outcome, but it is displayed when the determinations take primacy over listening to the cries of those whose humanity is being denied. Dehumanization here comprises the severing of connections to and the denial of responsibilities towards subjects in space. And this maybe takes us beyond and through racialization, as racism is mutually constituted with gender, sexuality, location, class, and other dimensions of social difference. As Maria Lugones and decolonial feminists argue, and as we heard this morning from Denise, coloniality entailed a racialized restructuring of gender, sexuality, and embodiments, a brutal process of eradication of memory, social organization, and subjectivity. So in this context, and following from decolonial arguments, the race is not a singular corporeal, epistemic, affective, and other dimension of power, but it's always intersectional. Another point which I think comes out from Fanonite argument is that coloniality of being is not necessarily associated with a lack of agency. According to recent analysts, Fanon offers us the possibility for imagining the zone of non-being as a site of action to affirm and to nurture black life. And perhaps we can extend that to indigenous life and to other racialized groups. So despite originating in critiques of colonial modern racialization, the coloniality of being identifies a different problem space where plurality, responsibility, and distributed harm and non-harm co-constitute the basis for ethics and politics. Tackling the coloniality of being presumes no intrinsic racial or subaltern or superior positioning for those who listen or respond to the cries of those whose humanity is being denied. Responsibility is distributed, even as acting responsibly relies upon specific historical and geographical situations, institutions, and resources. So in this sense, taking development beyond a concern with racism to coloniality of being re-engages with the questions of anti-colonialism and post-development core concerns. So I now want to consider some actions which counter dehumanization But I also want to raise questions about whether we, in moving forward in that rehumanization, whether we need to still tackle the power of whiteness more directly and more explicitly. So I've got a number of different examples. One praxis has been the creation of networks within and outside universities across the global south, which aim to walk with social movements, to challenge what we know and think about epistemic racism, land grabbing, intersectional forms of violence. So the Retos group in Abya Yala, or in America Latina, is one example of this. Now here, the emphasis is very much on the action of activism, academic work in coalition across differences of class, education, gender, race, and sexuality. The networks of Retos recognize that all encounters are encounters across difference, following Sara Ahmed, for example. But it does raise the issue, I think, and it's been raised in a couple of the conversations in the last couple of days, is what do we then think about internalized intersectional coloniality of being? How do we address the ways in which whiteness has been taken for granted and is unconscious for many people, and how do we also address this sort of internalized, racialized sense of being internalized by other groups? And this means addressing a sort of decolonizing of the mind, which takes both racialization and the power of whiteness into account and really takes this forward. Now, there's certainly no easy answers I have to offer here, but I think that breaking with a one world view and trying to work away from a sort of racialized hierarchy of knowledge can perhaps move us in that direction. So there's a couple of examples I give in a paper, one of which is the indigenous women working in multiracial alliances across Guatemala, Bolivia, and elsewhere, who are trying to connect the violence against women's bodies in connection with the violence against territories as a result of extractivism. And they have been coming up with a new notion of body territory, or cuerpo territorio, in order to try and challenge the racialized violence and the attacks on life from gender violence, maternal mortality, and corporate enclosures of land, and the closing down of life spaces. And here we see in this politics and in the politics of food sovereignty, I think what we see is an assertion of life from marginal racialized subjects, which is a response to the racialization of colonial modernity and development. And although they're not using an anti-racist language or politics, they are articulating the validity of the forms of life of racialized subjects. And I think that this kind of dynamic between kind of rehumanization, the affirmation of a flourishing human life, regardless of its position within a racialized society, opens up the possibility for an understanding of the suppleness and the innovation that we're seeing in a number of different sites of decolonizing praxis. And I just wanted to touch upon three characteristics here. The first is the ineluctably human and hence contingent, partial and situated groundings of these projects. Despite the obstacles ranged against them, projects for decolonized forms of life continue under, within, and in relation to development programs, macroeconomic materialities, and colonial modern dismissal of racialized groups. And the example I give in the paper that I won't really have time to go into is the Guarani notion of Nyandereko, which in one way is a statement of Guarani culture and customs, but which Guarani themselves acknowledge is already entangled with and having to, it predates but also engages very much with the rapidly changing situation today. So it's always a contingent and continuous reworking of this decolonizing practice in which there's no essentialized notion of a Nyandereko essence or Guarani positionality, but there is a challenge to the coloniality of being. So the question here is this a possibility to challenge racialization? Do we need to think more about internalized, racialized being and knowledge? And how could decolonizing in this context tackle the power of whiteness? And this is very important politically and analytically because the decolonial in some spaces today is being reappropriated into nationalist proclamations of uniqueness and a successful decolonizing. And I'm thinking here in part of Bolivia and the politics of Evo Morales, but I'm also listening to South African colleagues who say that the decolonial has been sort of fixed as the answer to sort of problems in the national space. And in comparison to that fixing of a particular notion of the decolonizing and solution to these problems of racialization and knowledge and power, indigenous scholars in the Andes, and I'm thinking here of Huasca Ari and also of Inuka Lechon, who I'm going to come back to talk about in a minute, they really historicize their respective groups' engagement with the politics of indigeneity and the politics of transformation, the politics of challenging racial exclusion. And they show that it's an incredibly long, complicated, entangled process. Okay, so they're really moving away from any singular sort of notion of a neat decolonial subject who has sort of stood outside these problematic relations of power, race, and knowledge. So what I'm suggesting is that we can also learn from this. We can also think about these decolonizing agendas within plural, located, and always in construction knowledge projects, which are always in relation to these wider power dynamics. The second dimension is something that we've heard about a lot in the conference here, and that's about the decolonizing struggles for dignity, humanity, and life, which discard the modern Western division between nature and the human. The presentation of the pluriverse dictionary yesterday gave us examples of this. The important thing here, I think, is that we can also perhaps think about the way that racialization has always been expressed in part through association with animals and with nature. So I think in these moves to recast our understanding of connections between humans and nature, I think we have to be very careful that we don't reinscribe the power of whiteness into those accounts. And I'm thinking here of amazing work by Charlene Mollett talking about the ways in which notions of human rights already contain within them notions which are more appropriate for ontologically secure white position subjects rather than racialized subjects. And third, and related to the above points, is that decolonizing actions for rehumanizing rely very directly and materially and in embodied ways on relations of care. Care and healing relations between intersectionally positioned human subjects entail the laborious, cyclically repetitive, often daily, often draining, and largely unacknowledged work that goes into the maintenance and creativity and dynamism of a decolonizing process. Now, we heard this afternoon from Wendy and from Ariel about the importance of social reproduction. So I presume that many of you will be familiar with those debates. But the point that I would want to draw out is, that, of course, and it came up earlier, is that it's not merely the practical mechanics of social reproduction that the decolonizing praxis entails. It's also that it is founded upon an ethics of care in which the normative goal is to reverse the bare life redistributed to certain groups and to promote the flourishing of human and more than human life forms. So in this way, decolonizing, this interpretation of decoloniality, comprises a praxis of healing, which counteracts and seeks to repair the injuries of slow violence. But again, what are the racialized dimensions of this process? On the one hand, we have non-white subjects who often bear disproportionate burdens for the process of care, practically and also in terms of guiding an ethics of care. And that is a lot of work for people who are racialized and already carrying a burden from other dimensions of their oppression. But the second aspect of the racialization of these logics and ethics of care is that white positioned subjects arguably could take on more of the work of informing themselves about racialization and thereby incorporate onto themselves some of the labor that is involved in that process. So far, I hope I'm doing all right for time. Yeah, 5 minutes, okay. What I want to voice is a sense of urgency of challenging colonial modern dehumanization and the differential conditions to thrive that cumulatively affect highly diverse humans and not more than human living beings. But I've also argued that we need to do that while always very conscious of the colonial modern racial hierarchies and the knowledge politics of whiteness in which that rethinking, that urgent task needs to be undertaken. So I argue that unless addressed directly and openly, I think that racialization will continue silently in these dynamics. Now, I had a sort of a conclusion or a section about the politics, which I think is not going to be possible to cover in full. But just to give you an idea of the discussions, I am arguing in this section that we could perhaps usefully think about the political in a way that treats the public space as a space in which the unexpected happens and in which we can have an event which brings together different plural and political subjects which come out of the longer process of knowledge production from the margins. This is drawing in part on Icaza and Vasquez's paper. And if we also take the idea, which if Gregor is here, he mentioned earlier this afternoon, this is Inuka Lechon's idea of Yachai Tinkui, which refers to diverse and incommensurable knowledge projects that, quote, have concentrated and converged, end quote, in the public sphere to give content to indigenous politics since the 1930s. Now, this idea of Yachai Tinkui, I think, to me, speaks to the idea that the public sphere can be a point of connection between different knowledge projects, different epistemologies, different ontologies even. But I would, again, return to the theme that the public sphere is itself already constructed, already constituted as a white privileged space, and so the dynamics of racialization would arguably need to be addressed in that kind of politics, which is, I think, part of the kind of conversations that we're having here. So I look forward very much to hearing your questions and the discussion, and I'm sorry that I had prepared a lot, but I think that what this discussion, or what my presentation has tried to do, is also to respond to the kinds of debates that I've been hearing here. So I very much look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Sara. Now we will have the floor open to questions. Don't be shy.
I'm shy. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so rich and full, and I don't know if I captured all of it by the end of the day, to be honest. It was very much, very interesting, and I always very much enjoy reading all your papers. My question takes a departure. I think if I understood correctly, you said that projects for the decolonization of life would also happen or under structures of development or within those structures, or using them or whatever at one point. And I'm researching rural women in Brazil, and I've come upon some things that they do, which is like using formal politics and
Participatory, yeah.
to advance some claims and politics, which always were so surprising to me. They were so detailed in their politics of concerning seeds and very specific things, and they were putting forward concrete policies in a rather depoliticized space, which has been very much criticized. But I found always that they bring forward a kind of knowledge that I couldn't fully capture. And recently I was in contact with a friend of mine who's studying recycling collectives, also women collectives that do recycling, and she told some very similar stuff in relation to the national policy of recycling in Brazil, where those collectives brought forward small, but for them very decisive, it was not a big change that revolutionized and put out I don't know, Coca-Cola is like,
Yeah.
implementing structures that they don't like and respect it. So I thought, I was thinking of if maybe, because of my whiteness, I'm not able to fully capture the epistemologies or knowledges behind that, and then if I criticize the technification of politics, or if I don't kind of make impossible those kind of processes, and maybe if sometimes we don't really capture fully what is being done using structures of development in a wider sense, resources also.
Yeah.
So maybe if I as a white positioned scholar from Europe am not able to capture some of the logics there and some of the concepts of change and political strategies, and by criticizing certain processes, maybe I kind of am a big hindrance and turning myself into a big problem. That was
Right. But I think that those issues are very much at the heart of the paper. I think in yes, and I think that you know, in one way, I suppose that I'm saying that, you know, even before we start the project with the rubbish recyclers, or before we start the project with the rural women in Brazil, or in my case with rural indigenous women in Ecuador, you know, in what ways precisely, you know, how are we thinking about our knowledge and our positionality from before the research project is formulated or whatever. And I think that part of that involves a conversation with oneself about the positionality and the privileges it offers and the ignorances that it sanctions, and also thinking through what, you know, in what ways is anti-blackness or anti-indigeneity being constituted in this particular context. You know, where's the coloniality is a question, or where's the racialized coloniality in a particular context, and then maybe a research question emerges out of that, or it emerges in relation to, you know, I also think that in encounters between differently positioned subjects around a commonly held research question or an activist question is an important sphere. I think that white positioned subjects tend to get more out of it than racialized subjects. So that's where some of my, I mean, I haven't got an easy answer, but I think that, you know, those kinds of issues seem, to me at least at the moment, to be something of a way to think through it for myself.
I can be selfish and pose a question, my own considerations. So you talk about how racialized hierarchies are visible but often you spoke about how racialized hierarchies are visible but often ignored.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile the ambiguity between the point of view which seeks a type of indigenous liberation against the perpetuation or reproduction of these racialized hierarchies?
Well, this is not an original point, but I think it's worth remaking in this context, which is that it's a question of who they're visible to and who they're ignored by. And I think that, I mean, on the one hand, although there were efforts soon after the new constitution and in the context of new development programs to try and have an observatory of racism in Ecuador, to try and make racism visible, because in the context of Latin America, which many of you will be familiar with, the sort of nationalist ideology of racial mixing is supposed to overcome racial discrimination, but in fact it's underlain by the sort of privileging of a Eurocentric point of view. So although activists and scholars tried to make racism visible, and there were various attempts to link the plurinational intercultural state politics with a sort of politics of anti-racism. And that actually worked at the national scale to make Afro-descendant groups more visible and more politically central to the Ecuadorian government programs than the indigenous populations who previously had a much higher profile in the kind of racial contestations in the country, but when they split with the government, they were very sidelined. And also there's another issue, which is that indigenous people have been seen as, the question there is of culture. And the racialization of indigenous people has not been recognized, which I think is also a factor in this sort of paradox of visibility and invisibility.
Thank you, Sara. Very, very eloquent presentation. Beautiful. I'm just wondering, you mentioned capitalism, and I wondered what were the implications of your position for the future of capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Am I taking a couple of questions, do you think? Okay, sure.
Just three.
Yeah, okay.
No, it's different.
Yeah, that's fine.
I was very moved by the thoughts about dehumanization, because I think that in colonial modernity it's so much part of what we see in everyday life. You said that you mentioned the denial of relations and responsibilities to others. I would be interested in how you see what is the role of marking otherness in the processes of dehumanization, because you mentioned that whiteness is often not being remarked and marked in knowledge processes. So my question would be, how is the marking of others, and also how does difference play out and contribute to dehumanization in your opinion?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your presentation. So rich, and trying to grasp all the knowledge. You mentioned something about the policy space. I heard you mention the policy space will have been, I think, for the implementation of the decoloniality.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just want to talk about policy space, especially in relation to Africa. We found out that the policy arena is still taken over by the West, especially through the Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So what is our recommendation towards them? Because we see the power of whiteness in their policy intervention, even starting from the consultant. You cannot say, for example, if there is when consultants are needed, it is still the whites that is the team lead. In most of
The white who is what, sorry?
like the team lead, team leader, like when there is needs like policy intervention in an African country, sometimes the consultants, or because World Bank will use consultants or the World Bank staff that will be sent to those areas are going to be the whites. Even when they open like they open it up for people to apply for those positions, we find out that if you are going to use like a black person or an indigenous, it's going to be for the small aspect of it, then the leader is going to be somebody coming from Spain or coming from, at the end of the day, it's still like the power of whiteness is still overtaking these spaces, and then the policy arena where we need decoloniality is still taken over by the power of whiteness. I also want to ask, how are we helping the local people to rediscover the value in themselves? Because sometimes the local people, they also see themselves as inferior version of the white, that they don't see value from their culture, they don't see value in the solutions they have, which is the benefit that the white man also enjoy.
Thank you for three very challenging, very broad-ranging questions. I'll start with the last, I think. I agree with you that I think that policy space is very much reproduced over time as one which privileges a white position subject whose educational training, whose professional context and the institutional pressures on individuals is going to reinforce a particular worldview and bring in a particular way of offering solutions to different countries and so on. And I think that the power of white position subjects and their knowledges to travel, and this idea that policy, the policy that travels is the more generalized, abstracted model, structural adjustment and so on. And those are the ones that have that mobility across space and the capacity to sort of land in a particular country and define what the parameters of decision making are going to be, and that is based on this very racialized understanding of knowledge that racialized subjects produce empirical sort of facts or data, but their knowledge does not travel. And I think that part of the decolonizing process has to be, and it's illustrated by various of the networks that have been mentioned at this meeting, the bringing together of knowledges in solidarity in the consolidation of traveling alternatives to those sort of Eurocentric forms of understanding the world. So how do people discover themselves and overcome the sort of racialized evaluation of their knowledges? I think it's through a very concrete, very practical efforts to build alternatives. And I can't see, and this maybe goes back to Ariel's question, I don't see a sort of single solution to this kind of thing. I think it comes out of very practical, very concrete experiments, actually, and continual experimentation around thinking through issues and continually questioning them and going on to the next stage of practical application in light of new scenarios and new settings and so on. But again, combined with that really critical engagement with the power of whiteness in all of its dimensions. That's what I also hope has kind of come through in my talk today. Isabella's question, dehumanization, yes, something which I think comes through in everyday life, and one can go to scenarios in Europe of the dehumanization of refugees and people trying to cross the Mediterranean, people at the moment trying to cross the British Channel to come into the United Kingdom, who are being told by their traffickers that Brexit will mean that they won't be able to get into the United Kingdom. That dehumanization and marking of otherness, it takes place in a lot of different spheres. It takes place in the news, it takes place in everyday conversations, it takes place in the the dismissal of somebody as an equal interlocutor. So in all of those dimensions, that dehumanization can take place. And I think that because the status of a white position subject is such that their own positionality is not questioned, their own articulation of the world and the way that they deal with the world is not challenged unless they are coming up against people articulating a sort of anti-racist argument, which brings whiteness into the conversation. Because whiteness is a race, and so we have to, or it's part of a racialization, and therefore it has to be kind of named and addressed. And Ariel, what implications for the future? I think, Quijano argues that modern colonial capitalism has been operating through classifications of race and the allocation of differently racialized subjects into different sectors of the economy. And that's been going on for 500 years, according to his argument. And I think that what is interesting is that I would say that we sometimes presume that subjects carry their race into their labor. Whereas I think that, the laboring done by a subject or a group of subjects, it can also racialize, that these things are kind of relationally constituted. So, for example, groups in, I think it's India, but also in Japan, who work with skins of animals are racialized. And so I think that, it's not just a question of changing capitalism, it's also a question of changing the way in which we, just as you have worked with the ways in which certain types of labor in social reproduction have become associated with and now done by women, so too one can argue that certain kinds of work have been done by racialized subjects, and that constitutes in part their racialization.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you so much for your presentation today. It was very intellectually invigorating, and I have many, many more questions for you, but we can discuss afterwards, as I'm sure others would like to engage with you further. So if we could give Sara another round of applause.